English. So before we get started tonight, I just wanted to do a brief land acknowledgement that tonight I'm coming to you from unceded Miwok and Yokuts land, where CVAQ is located in, covering the whole San Joaquin Valley. I just wanted to briefly recognize that we are on this land.
Todos estamos en esta tierra, en este terreno, y hemos participado en el desalojo de estas personas y reconocemos que hay conocimiento indígena que se tiene que reconocer y amarrar este trabajo que hacemos para limpiar el aire en el valle. Y dicho esto, le doy la palabra al director de
Garoupa-White to give some context on tonight.
Thank you, Cynthia, and everyone for joining us this evening. My name is Dr. Catherine Garoupa-White, and I am the Executive Director for CVAQ. I will be speaking in the second part of this panel, but wanted to offer some brief context in terms of the dynamics of the San Joaquin Valley. And also just to give you a sense of the agenda, I'll do a quick overview of the dynamics of the Valley, then I will pass it to Cynthia to introduce our next panelist. After they share, I'll also be presenting briefly on some research that I've done, and then we'll have the opportunity for questions and interaction with you all. So the Q&A is slated to go towards the end. So welcome again, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us to talk about air pollution in the San Joaquin Valley and how, if we don't address regulatory capture, we're not fundamentally going to be able to get to the root causes of the problem. So first, talking about, what is the political, economic, and kind of social context of the San Joaquin Valley. Our economy, our politics, and our pollution are rooted in what we refer to in shorthand as DOA. In some spaces, that means dead on arrival, as we know our air pollution is causing very bad health effects and even early death. And so DOA in this context stands for Development, Oil, and Agriculture. So we have both sprawling land use and transportation planning.
Usamos la tierra y también hemos visto crecimiento en lo que llamamos recursos de magneto, donde están los centros de distribución, y eso genera muchísimo tráfico que contribuye a nuestro problema de polución. Históricamente, California y sobre todo el condado Kern es uno de los productores más importantes de petróleo de los Estados Unidos, y eso viene con un costo severo a la salud y el ambiente. Y por último, agricultura industrializada. El Valle de San Joaquín se reconoce por ser la región agricultora más productiva que ha existido en la vida, y tenemos operaciones a escala grande con millones de toneladas de pesticidas, más operaciones de calentamiento a los animales y equipo grande que contribuye a nuestros problemas de polución. Y como resultado, tenemos muchos problemas sociales y medioambientales por esta dependencia a esta base económica extractiva. Y para darles un par de indicadores para el contexto del Valle de San Joaquín, nosotros como región tenemos niveles altos de pobreza persistente y concentrada. Pobreza persistente es pobreza que dura más de 2 décadas.
Indicator of intergenerational mobility, upward social mobility. People who are born into a low-income household being able to advance themselves, frankly, is not happening on average in the San Joaquin Valley because of the lack of opportunity. We also have concentrated poverty, which means that wealthy people are living in wealthy neighborhoods, which are going to tend to have better amenities, better schools, more trees, and poor people are living in poor communities with a lack of infrastructure and a concentration of pollution sources. So recall just a minute ago that I said the San Joaquin Valley is one of the most productive agricultural regions that has ever existed in humankind, and place that next to the fact that we have some of the highest rates of food insecurity in the entire state. So we're growing the crops, we're getting the pollution from the crops. A lot of people are out in the fields working hard to pick those crops, but often can't afford or have access to them. We also have some of the most contaminated aquifers in the nation, and we're one of the largest alterations of the Earth's surface that is attributable to humankind. And the root cause, again, is because we've been mining groundwater for agriculture. So as a result, we're one of the most polluted air basins for ozone, and we are the most polluted air basin in the entire United States for particulate matter or fine particles, which can be particularly harmful because of their ability to penetrate the lungs, get into the bloodstream, and really inflame your entire immune system, but also contribute to things like heart attack and stroke. The maps that you see on the right side of my screen, the first one is CalEnviroScreen 4.0. This is a tool that was developed by the state that layers social and environmental indicators to show where the most disproportionately impacted communities are. So that red rash you see down the center of California is the San Joaquin Valley. We have a large percentage of the highest ranking communities on CalEnviroScreen. The other two images are NASA satellite photos from space of our air pollution problem. To talk just briefly about the political context of the San Joaquin Valley, and again, layer this back to some of our other social indicators, the Legislative Analyst's Office several years ago did an analysis of the ballot proposal that a few of you may remember that's actually depicted on this map. The proposal was to split California into 6 different states. So the San Joaquin Valley would sit in central California, which does include a few of our rural neighboring foothill counties. But part of why this is an important indicator on this map is because the analysis that the Legislative Analyst's Office did showed that if the ballot initiative was successful, that Central California would become the poorest state in the entire United States. The other thing that you can see from this map, of course, from the color coding, is voting for Republican versus Democrat. And again, to be clear here, I'm not promoting a particular political party. I'm merely pointing out the trends and the stereotype that California is considered to be a blue or a very liberal or sometimes even progressive state. But when you look at voting patterns, you see that Central California and the area that some refer to as the state of Jefferson, in fact, tends to vote more conservatively. And this is a trend that we see continue in 2016 and then 2020 as well. Particularly the further south you go in the San Joaquin Valley, the more you see that it's red. So overall, I would characterize our region as conservative, in some spaces libertarian, and in other spaces moderate Democrat, but fundamentally pro-business, pro-industry, and anti-regulation. So who's in charge of cleaning up the air? I'm just going to do this super high level because we're focusing just on one of these entities. But at the federal level, the national ambient air quality standards that were laid out in the Clean Air Act, this requirement to set health-based standards, those are managed at the federal level by the United States Environmental Protection Agency. At the state level, we have the California Air Resources Board, and they're generally in charge of mobile sources, consumer products, and helping the different regional air districts pull together state plans that they submit to the federal government for how we're going to meet those health protective standards. The focus for tonight is at this regional and local level, particularly at the San Joaquin Valley Air Pollution Control District, or Valley Air District for short. The Valley Air District is responsible for stationary sources, so those large smokestacks that you see coming out of facilities. They also create the regional part of our cleanup plan and help inform what local governments are doing. So tonight, this is the entity that we're going to focus on. And my last slide is just to give you all an overview and a sense of what the governance is. Who are the decision makers at the Valley Air District Governing Board that are charged with making decisions for us? And it will also come back up in my presentation about a case study that the Central Valley Air Quality Coalition ran a campaign to actually change the composition of this board to hopefully make them more accountable to public health. So I'll be talking a bit more about that later. So as of right now, the Valley Air District Governing Board is comprised of 15 members. So you have 1 representative from each county board of supervisors, and we have 8 counties. So that's 8 of the representatives. We then have 5 representatives from city councils that rotate between north, central, and south, small, medium, and large sized cities to provide a diversity of perspectives from the cities. And then The legislation that passed in 2007 added 2 governor appointees and 2 of those city council seats. And the 2 people appointed by the governor are supposed to be a practicing doctor and an expert in the health effects of air pollution. So I'm looking forward in just a little bit to talking more about this governance structure, what we've been able to change and improve about it, and what some of the outstanding issues still are. But before I get to that, I'm going to pass it back to Cynthia to introduce our first panelist.
Thanks, Catherine, for that context setting. So to begin tonight's discussion, we are going to pass the mic along to Cade Cannedy, who graduated from Stanford University in 2021 with a master's and undergraduate degrees. His undergraduate honors thesis, which is what they will be discussing today, was awarded the Firestone Medal, Stanford's top prize for undergraduate research. He now works as a community organizer and program manager at the Climate Resilient Communities, a Bay Area environmental justice organization working in East Palo Alto, Bellhaven, and North Fair Oaks. He's originally from Parado, New Mexico, a rural unincorporated community in the northern part of the state, just outside of Taos. So with that, welcome and pass you the mic, Cade.
Thank you very much, Cynthia, and thank you, Dr. Garoupa-White, for that introduction. I'm going to share my screen real quickly too, and sort of run through some slides that sort of explain the work I did and sort of its relationship to you all and the political conditions in the San Joaquin Valley writ large. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is just sort of the question I was trying to get at, and that was basically what makes a place successful at addressing its air quality problems, what makes it successful at cleaning up its air. So just to set the context, California is extremely overrepresented in the number of counties that have air quality problems, right? There's 41 counties in the United States that exceed national ambient air quality standards, and 28 of them are in California. So roughly 68% of the counties, or of the whole country's air pollution problem is in California. And likewise, there's been 82 counties that have had bad air quality, but have since improved it. And only 3 of those counties are in California. So, or about 4%. So we're extremely overrepresented in our problem of our air pollution problem, and extremely underrepresented in our success addressing it. And if you take the Bay Area, the San Joaquin Valley, and the South Coast, those 3 air basins together, there's between 14,000 and 24,000 annual premature deaths as a result of air pollution. And so one thing you have to kind of answer before you can figure out what makes people good or places good at solving their air quality problems is why it's bad in the first place. And if you look at this chart from the EPA, it shows that since the Clean Air Act was passed in 1970, emissions from all sources have fallen 75%, 73%, while GDP has gone up, population has gone up, vehicle miles traveled has gone up. And there's a couple of explanations that account for that.
I'm so sorry for the interruption. Can you please ask the panelists to speak a little slower?
Emissions control technologies like catalytic converters and wet scrubbers. But something that people don't often bring into that conversation is the role that globalization.
Is anyone listening to me on the English channel? Okay, thanks.
Cade, just to quickly interrupt, could you slow down a little bit for our interpreter, please?
No. Yep. I was wondering if that was gonna be a thing. So yeah, I'll slow it down a little bit. Yep. And so one thing that people don't often talk about is globalization, right? And the United States as a whole no longer really manufactures a lot of things in the United States, and instead imports them from countries abroad. So a big portion of these emissions reductions, it's difficult to say how much, but a large portion is due to that system where we've offshored a lot of production. But if you think about it from the Valley's perspective, like what are 2 things you can't really offshore? It's oil, which has a lot of geopolitical ramifications, and you want to kind of produce domestically. That's one argument for it, and food production. And a key point in that is that today about 4% of farms produce 66% of farm products, and that extreme level of concentration is coming primarily from the Valley. So if you think about any food you eat as having some emissions associated with its production, then the communities that house those 4% of farms are experiencing 66% of the emissions associated with that food production system. And that leads us to a really influential paper that was published in 1971 that essentially made the argument that that regulations themselves and rules governing pollution are themselves a market, meaning that there's a demand for regulation and there's a supply of regulation. And so industries, this paper said, as a rule, try to capture that regulation and try to influence that regulation. And so what I did was I looked at the economic makeup of the Bay Area, the South Coast, and the San Joaquin Valley, and sort of sorted them into anti-polluting and pro-polluting different industries, right? So anti-polluting industries might be things like real estate, tourism, things like that, where you'd want your air clean in order to, sell people on coming to your area. Whereas pro-polluting interests are things like manufacturing, agriculture, and oil and gas, things where having a lot of regulations would make you less profitable over time. And so based on those makeups, right, what you'd expect to see in the Bay Area is significant capture from real estate and from tourism industries. And that would coincide with stricter air pollution rules and stricter regulations, resulting in better air over time. In the South Coast around LA, you'd see more of a mixed picture because they do have some oil and gas development still. They have refineries, particularly in Wilmington. And so you'd see sort of a more mixed bag there in the South Coast. And in the San Joaquin Valley, you'd see significant capture from oil and gas and from agriculture. And so there'd be less progress in addressing air quality problems overall. And so in order to kind of test that theory, I went through the last 20 years of board members that sat on the Bay Area Air Quality Management District, the San Joaquin Valley Air Pollution Control District, and the South Coast Air Quality Management District, and did a really exhaustive survey of their background, their political affiliations, and ultimately was able to assign them a status of whether they were influenced by pro-polluting or anti-polluting industries. So to determine that conflict of interest, I looked at prior and future occupations. So whether you were someone who worked in real estate, whether you're someone who worked in oil and gas. I also looked at FPPC forms, which were Form 700s, which lists financial disclosures. So things that people personally own, stocks, companies, things like that. And I also looked at Form 460s, which are about campaign contributions. And then finally, I looked at relevant background information. So things like making open statements that would tie you to one industry or another. And then I also tried to parse their partisan affiliation just to see if there was any sort of relationship between Democrats being more or less captured than Republicans. And I found that that wasn't necessarily the case, that it was largely independent of political party. And so just a couple of results from that really extensive analysis. And I can sort of walk you through and show you more closely what I did. But overall, there was high prevalence of capture from polluting industries in the San Joaquin Valley. There was sort of a mixed bag, as was expected in the South Coast, and a lot of people who I couldn't figure out in the Bay Area. And that points to just a lot of sort of other ulterior motives that people might have for sitting on these boards. Like a lot of people might have, altruistic interests, for example. And to sort of explain, so I'll walk you real quickly through a few folks that you might recognize from the San Joaquin Valley Air Pollution Control District. Notably, now currently still sitting on the board is David Couch. And right here I have his Form 460, which I got from the County of Kern's Secretary of State office. And if you look through, this is just one 3-month period from January 1st, 2012 to March 17th, 2012. And if you go through and tally up all the folks here who gave David Couch money from, from the farming sector or from the oil and gas sector, you see about $10,000 from polluting interests across this just 3-month span in 2012. And then similarly, if you look at his Form 700, which you can see here, this is his financial disclosures where he talks about what stocks he owns. So he owns, a good amount of stocks that here in tobacco, in Monsanto. He owns between $2,000 and $10,000 of Monsanto stock, and he also owns stock in an oil equipment company and in an offshore drilling company. So he's very personally invested in industries that benefit economically from having low regulation and low pollution. Similarly, if you look at some of the other people on this list, Buddy Mendez is former chairman of the board and is a farmer for 38 years. He doesn't shy away from that fact. He just doesn't necessarily see it as a conflict of interest. But there's no getting around the fact that not having regulations on when you can shake almonds, how often you can shake almonds, and how you shake almonds makes you more or less profitable. So that in and of itself is a financial conflict, right? And whether or not these folks are making decisions based on their economic conflicts is very difficult to say. But what you can say is hey, David Couch, you have about $40,000 in investments in oil and gas and agriculture industry. And whether or not that affects his particular decision-making on the board, I think, is ultimately he knows. But you can assemble this evidence and it looks like it would at least be to their financial incentive to not be passing the most stringent regulation possible. A lot of folks also know Steve Worthley, who advocated for a long time for shrinking the Sequoia National Monument and opening it up to logging, and had made a lot of his bones as a lawyer working in the agriculture and law realm. And then also you might recognize Henry Perea, who sat on the Fresno City Council and was the assembly member from the 31st District. And I think I also have his LinkedIn pulled up here. Let's see, where is he working now? Oh, he's working at Chevron now. So these are just a few of the, let's see, roughly 34 or 23 folks that had polluting interests that have sat on the San Joaquin Valley Air Pollution Control Board in the past 20 years. And significantly, when those folks hold a majority, there's very little done. And you can see in terms of the days of exceedance of the 2006 particulate matter standard, they've gone down, with a slope of about -2 over time, over those 20 years, which is not very significant progress, especially when compared to places like the South Coast, which have seen a very dramatic decline over those same 20 years. And just briefly to recap some of those findings, I think these graphs here from the San Joaquin Valley Air Pollution Control District demonstrate it well. Sorry about that. I'll just leave it here. These really demonstrated that these lines are flat. These lines are flat over 20 years, and that's like this is from the San Joaquin Valley Air Pollution Control District's own reports, and so they're not even mincing words about their own mixed bag of success in terms of this problem, right? There's been very little accomplished over the past 20 years, and part of that is the result of this intense regulatory capture on the board. And so just going over the conclusions of my research, one, capture is prevalent and independent of political party. In the Bay Area, for example, there was Cade Rice, who owns about $50,000 of Chevron stock, but was a Democrat and was from like in the North Bay. In the South Coast, there was a Republican who had anti-polluting interests because he was really significantly invested in the real estate market, was the president of local real estate associations. And then in the San Joaquin Valley, there was, Henry Perea, who was a Democrat, ran as a Democrat, marketed himself as a Democrat, now works for Chevron. very unabashedly. So it's really independent of political party. The second important conclusion is that it's very difficult to prove that someone is captured in making decisions based upon their interests, right? Their financial interests. But what you can do is assemble the evidence and say, hey, it would certainly be in your direct financial interest to pass lax regulations. And whether or not you're doing that or that's your motivation, only you as David Couch or Henry Perea or whoever know, then that's up to you. But I think, the public aren't fools, right? We see what's happening. We see the lack of progress over 20 years, over a really long time, when air quality has gotten dramatically better in a lot of places. And so it really doesn't take much to add those two and two together. Third, capture is really only problematic when it thwarts the preference of the voter, right? In the Bay Area, for example, there's a lot of capture from anti-polluting interests, and they're really pushing stricter and stricter measures in order to make sure the air is clean so that people want to travel to the North Bay, people want to buy real estate in the North Bay. And that's fine because that's what people in the North Bay want, right? But in the San Joaquin Valley, where we see survey after survey show that 53, 55, a majority percentage of people want stricter air regulations, and yet they don't happen, that's when capture is really problematic, right? Fourth, the disproportionate concentration of air pollution in low-income communities of color, really breaks political levers of redress, right? So if you're someone who's dealing with food insecurity, housing insecurity, all those things that Dr. Garoupa-White was mentioning in the introduction, it makes it difficult for you to organize your community around, around something that's going to ultimately prove to be problematic for your health, but it's 10 years away. Whereas a lot of other concerns are a lot more immediate, right? And fifth, I think the solution that ultimately came out of all my work is that centralization of power over air quality is the only way we're going to make progress, right? Right now, as Dr. Garoupa-White mentioned, there's 15 members of the board, and they're all, 8 of them are supervisors from each of these counties. And it's very difficult. Like the majority of people don't know that their local supervisor is the one in charge of their air, right? And doesn't know how to hold them accountable. And these local elections are always very low turnout. So it's very difficult to break through that sort of situation. And all of the other problems in the Valley, all the other difficulties people are experiencing and are sort of they create like a self-fulfilling prophecy wherein, you're not going to put the refinery in Palo Alto, right? You're just not going to be able to do it because the people there have too many resources. They have too much time on their hands. And so where does it get put? It gets put in the places where people have the least amount of resources to defend themselves, right? And so it becomes sort of a self-fulfilling cycle where that polluting activity gets located in low-income communities and then drives down property values further, making it, in California, one of the only affordable places that you can live. So poor people move to the Central Valley, and it just keeps building on itself, right? And so it's my opinion that centralization of this power, taking power away from the San Joaquin Valley Air Pollution Control District, is the only way that we're going to see meaningful progress in the air quality in the San Joaquin Valley. And I also think that Dr. Garoupa-White's paper, her case study of what they were able to do, CVAQ was able to do in organizing the community and changing the way people talk about the issue in order to get public health experts on the board, was a really important step and might also represent another path forward is mass community organization and mobilization around this issue, because otherwise it's going to continue to be flat lines for as long as it's profitable to keep polluting the air. So thank you for your time and for listening today. And yeah, thank you to Dr. Garoupa-White for having me on. Thank you.
Thank you, Cade. And we'll be dropping his full thesis linked into the chat in a minute. But also just a reminder, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to drop them in the chat. We'll have a little bit of time to answer some of them at the end. but now we'll switch over to back to Dr. Catherine Garoupa-White, Valley native, adjunct faculty in geography, to discuss some of the regional movement building opportunities in the Valley. So take it away, Catherine.
Thank you, Cynthia, and thank you so much, Cade, for that really informative presentation. I couldn't help but note at the end there, as you were talking about flatlining, that it connected directly back to my dead on arrival analogy, that it's not only progress to clean air that's flatlining, that we're not moving forward, but it's people's lives that are being shortened and people who are dying prematurely as a result. So for me, it's really important to start my portion of the presentation and talking about one of the case studies that I did for my doctoral dissertation to set the context that I am what's called an activist scholar, which means I do research to inform my advocacy, and I do advocacy informed by research. They are meant to be complementary and to work together, because for me, scholarship by itself is meaningless, right? Why are we producing research if it's not something that we're going to take action on and really fundamentally change about the world? I actually started my career early on with the Central Valley Air Quality Coalition, or CVAQ for short, in 2006, and spent 5 years working on this issue before I left to get my PhD, because I was so frustrated by the lack of progress. So I was very driven during my PhD program to find answers to why the San Joaquin Valley is so polluted and what we can do to change these circumstances. And I found it to be a really exciting and rich opportunity to document, share, and uplift some of the campaign successes and stories of CVAQ as a regional movement building organization that's a key part of our infrastructure in the Valley, and that I'm really proud to be a part of. So the case study that I looked at in one of the chapters of my dissertation, which also was published into a shorter journal article that we've shared with you all, and that the link will be dropped in the chat in case you haven't had a chance to look at it yet, focused specifically on a 5-year legislative campaign that CVAQ took very early on in its inception. So CVAQ started in about the year 2000 as a coalition of different organizations invested in restoring clean air to the San Joaquin Valley, with a focus on disproportionately impacted communities of color and low-income communities. And very early on, our leadership recognized that in conversations at the Air District, when decisions were being made about how to clean the air, that health and science all too often were left out of the conversation. And again, in all fairness, that was not the capacity of these decision makers, right? Members of the County Board of Supervisors and the City Council work on a variety of things and come from different backgrounds. They're not necessarily specialized in or knowledgeable in the health impacts of air pollution and the science of how to solve the problem. So very early on, CVAQ leadership decided to initiate a legislative effort to add a doctor and a scientist to the Air District Governing Board appointed by the governor, and the bill also added 2 city council members. So just to give you a sense of the timeline, again, the early 2000s, the CVAQ coalition is forming, and this campaign kicks off very early on in the coalition's inception. It took 5 years of negotiating, organizing, bargaining, doing regular visits to the Capitol to inform our legislators to get SB 719 adopted. In 2006 to 2011, this is the time frame where I'm working as first a community organizer with CVAQ, and then I become the director. The Environmental Justice Advisory Group, just FYI, is the other case study that I looked at that I'm not going to be discussing tonight, but it's also described on the timeline. And so in 2015 is when I completed data collection. So 2011, I left, started my PhD program. So the other thing is that gave me some distance and some time from working as an advocate at CVAQ to step back and approach it from a scientific perspective, do research, review archives, interview people to really get this perspective on what were the intended and unintended consequences of passing this bill. Did it do the things that we hoped that it would accomplish, which is fundamentally improving decision-making at the Air District, creating better outcomes for clean air? And so some of the research questions I was exploring were, how was the issue being framed by the San Joaquin Valley Air District, and how were advocates framing the issue? What were some of the advocacy strategies that CVAQ used in order to amplify our frame? And how successful were we? What were some of the limitations, the challenges, and again, some of those unintended consequences? So first, in just thinking about the culture and the approach, the framing of the Valley Air District and how they explain our air pollution problems. And again, many of you are from the Valley, so you're familiar with this. It's an visuals that we often see driving down the freeway, these billboards that encourage us to practice healthy air living, right? If we each just make one change, if we carpool, that will clean the air. Not large industrial polluters that are directly within the control of the San Joaquin Valley Air District, but you, individual consumer, right, who needs to get to work, who needs to pick up their kid, who has other things to do, you should carpool. And if you don't, this is part of why we have an air pollution problem, right? In some circles, we would call that victim blaming. There's also a very common narrative about the fact that the Valley is a bowl, that we have pollution that drifts in from the Bay Area, that we have pollution that drifts in from China, that it's really mobile sources and that's the state and they need to regulate it, right? A lot of narratives from the Valley Air District about how it's everybody else's responsibility except for their own. And in all fairness, this is a larger pattern that we see in the San Joaquin Valley and goes to some of those economic assumptions that Cade was talking about earlier, that essentially has designated the San Joaquin Valley as a sacrifice zone, where people's lives, the land, the air, the water is worth less. So basically all of the bad things can just be dumped there because it's the most cost effective. So just to give you a sense of a few examples of what I mean in the 16 years that I've been working on trying to clean the air in the Valley and navigate these negotiations with the San Joaquin Valley Air District, a few things that have happened just in the last few years that I consider to be strong evidence of the bias towards industry. A review of the emissions reduction credit program managed by the Valley Air District and used largely by the oil industry showed that the program lacked transparency and consistency in keeping paperwork and applying policies to the favor of industry, resulting in lower credit prices and more pollution in our neighborhoods. The Valley Air District also has recently lost some notable lawsuits showing that they've delayed implementation of best practices for attaining clean air in the Valley. Just two examples, there was recently a decision that the ozone plan lacks adequate backup measures so that if we don't meet the standards in time, we have a plan in place for the other things that we should be doing. A court also recently determined that the Air District unlawfully passed a regulation that effectively exempted the oil refineries in our air basin from air monitoring requirements. The pattern of subsidizing industry and obstructing or delaying best practices comes at a severe cost to public health and our local economies, and the significant funding that the Valley Air District receives should be carefully monitored and accounted for so that we're not just giving out free tractors to farmers who frankly don't need them anymore and who might not actually be reducing our air pollution if it's equipment that they don't actually need. That's probably not the best investment. And again, the reason why we're doing this is because this is our everyday life. This is our health. This is the health of our children and future generations. Sadly, this t-shirt from Action Days that's pictured here at the top is actually outdated because more recently, at least in some of our counties, our average asthma rate has gone up to 1 in 4 children have asthma. At this time in the 2009-2010 timeframe when this photo was taken, the statistic was 1 in 5. Compared to the national average, children in the Valley are twice as likely to be diagnosed with asthma before the age of 18. So those pollutants that I mentioned earlier that we really struggle with, the fine particles and the ground level ozone, have a very serious impact on our health. And when CVAQ formed, it was out of recognition of these problems and hearing from our community members how negatively the air pollution was impacting their health, their quality of life, their ability to feel safe, allowing their children to play outside. Clearly, we don't have the resources, the longevity, the money that these industries have, but what we do have is people power. What we do have is movement building. What we do have is the ability to organize. One of CVAQ's founding and signature events in order to get SB 719 has been an annual trip to Sacramento to let legislators know what our community members want for clean air in the San Joaquin Valley. And again, getting that bill passed was the culmination of 5 years of organizing. It was an immense movement building effort that required talking to thousands of Valley residents and getting them engaged with their decision makers. It also required our coalition building capacity across the state as a part of a broader environmental justice movement. Because typically, if local legislators in our region oppose a bill, legislators from other parts of the state will defer to them as the local leaders. To get SB 719 passed, to add that doctor and scientist to the Air District Governing Board, we had to get legislators from other parts of the state to hear our voices and to recognize that our own representatives were not fully representing us, that they needed to override them and vote in support of SB 719 in order to help us address the power disparities that we were dealing with. So what this map depicts is both where our core leadership is based and driven by decision-making within the San Joaquin Valley, but also that we have a lot of important partners in other parts of the state that are a part of the movement of helping create clean air. Because as much as we know the San Joaquin Valley as a region is a sacrifice zone, we also fully acknowledge and center that it's communities where Black and Indigenous people and people of color live, where low-income communities live, where the largest and most polluting facilities are located. Just another indicator of the broad-based coalition that had to be developed and the powers that we were up against is looking at the support and opposition lists for this bill. So on the left-hand column, you're going to see a lot of our community-based organizations, right? Central Valley Air Quality Coalition, Center on Race, Poverty, and the Environment, Californians for Pesticide Reform, California Rural Legal Assistance Foundation, going up against California Cotton Ginners, Fresno County Farm Bureau, Nisei Farmers League, Western States Petroleum Association. These are incredibly powerful lobbies. So the fact that we were able to get this bill passed, again, an enormous and immense showing of power building. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that a big part of how we had success, because I had the fortune of being in the Capitol the day that the bill passed and going around to offices. Service Employees International Union, the labor movement, came and had so many meetings with us, and that show of solidarity was a big part, along with those partners from other parts of the state that really got this bill across the finish line. Now, that being said, it didn't necessarily achieve all of the things that we wanted it to do, right? So we added the 2 governor appointees, we added 2 city council members. That's 4 out of 15. And the County Board of Supervisors that are gonna represent those rural ag and oil interests are still 8 out of 15, which means that when it comes to voting, that they still have the majority. So while we've seen the importance of building champions and supporters from across the state, of working with labor, and of making sure that we have representation that has the expertise that we need to make better decisions, fundamentally, it hasn't actually changed the votes that we're seeing come out of the San Joaquin Valley Air District. So we didn't get everything that we wanted out of it. And some of that got negotiated out as we were trying to get the bill passed. So originally, the 2 representatives from the city councils were supposed to be 2 representatives from environmental justice communities. So it's incomplete. We know that there's still much more to be done to get the solutions that we want. Potentially nothing short of a governance overhaul or transformation of the decision-making at the Valley Air District might be what's required, because our situation is so bad at this point that we really need to give the power back to the people and the most impacted people to really drive the decision-making to get us to clean air, and not just clean air, but to achieve environmental justice, to make sure that the most overburdened communities are the ones that see relief first and fastest, and that's sustained over time. Fundamentally, part of what we're doing as a movement in building regional capacity and supporting local grassroots organizing is to try to move ourselves up the ladder of citizen participation. We're tired of being manipulated. We're tired of being placated. We want power, right? We want partnership. We want control. And unfortunately, as you can see from my little parachuter here, we're not there yet. We're still in non-participation and tokenization in a lot of spaces. And fundamentally, what we need is citizen power. We have reality where we have a lot of these different power differentials and disparities. And really what we want is social equity and liberation, the opportunity to think about a world without cars, without large polluting industries, with well-paying jobs in a caring and life-affirming economy where everybody has what they need in order to thrive and survive. And California is one of the richest states in one of the richest countries that has ever existed. So if we can't do it here, I'm not sure where we as human beings are going to be able to achieve this. Tons of different references from all my research, and definitely happy to provide more details offline. And looking forward to some discussion and questions and answers from folks. So do feel free to drop those in the chat. That's my contact information. Again, and really want to appreciate and thank everybody who came out tonight. Thanks staff for supporting this, and thank Cade as my co-panelist. So to kick us off, I did just want to ask a little bit more, Cade, because I'm curious. We've talked before, and I know you're not from the San Joaquin Valley. So can you tell me a little bit about what motivated and inspired you to do this research?
Yeah, good question. Thank you for that presentation as well, Dr. Garoupa-White. That's really, it's really, yeah, it fills you with some hope to see what can be done, you know, under the right circumstances and with the right tenacity. To answer your question, I think one thing that was really influential in my life was I grew up about 8 miles away from a molybdenum mine that was owned by Chevron. And I saw the bind that the community was constantly in, right? Like when you know, half the people are employed by the mine, but it's simultaneously poisoning people. It's sort of a similar dynamic to what's happening in the valley, where a lot of people depend economically on agriculture, depend economically on oil and gas, but at the same time, it's poisoning them, you know. And I think one big question that people try and, like, you know, frame the argument as is like, oh well, one day we'll be rich enough to solve all these problems. We'll be rich enough and we can solve the air pollution problem in the valley. And that's something that I heard, you know, growing up too. It's like, oh, when everyone's rich enough from the mining, like we can shut it down and everything will be fine. But why don't instead we ask, is the mining, is our economic reliance on these sectors making us poorer faster than it's making us rich, right? Is it not destroying our health, costing us more in terms of our medical bills and everything faster than it's putting food on our tables, right? And I think we've hit that inflection point in a lot of places. And so, yeah, when I got to school, I think it was the summer after my sophomore year, I went down to the Central Valley. I spoke to you. I spoke to a lot of other folks there, CCEJN, just a lot of folks that were really dedicated to the problem, and it felt a lot like home. Like I immediately sort of saw all the parallels open back up, and I wanted to figure out why things were the way they were, and that's sort of what got me into it. And did we want to open it up to questions from the audience now, or I have questions I could ask you too, Dr. Garoupa-White?
Yeah, thanks, Cade, for that response. It's good to know a little bit of your background. And I know we have quite a mixed audience tonight. For some of you, this is a totally new topic, and some of you are experts and have been working on this for a super long time. So yes, in the time we have left, we'd love to open it up to you all. If you all have any comments or questions you want to share, feel free to drop it in the chat, raise your hand, come off of mute and chat with us. Otherwise, while we give people a minute to think about it, Cade, why don't we start with one quick question you might have for me?
Sure. I guess one thing that I wanted to ask was just, why is it that the framing or the way that you talk about issues matters so much for building a movement or cutting through some of those layers of resistance you've had in the past?
Yeah, great question. So part of what framing helps us to do is understand a problem and who is ultimately responsible for it. So when I was talking about the narrative that the Air District offers, right, that it's not their fault, that it's coming from other places, that if people made one change, that's their framing of why we have air pollution and any inequity in the valley. So as a movement of people that know that that's not true, what we offered is a counter frame, right? No, actually, it's homegrown. It's largely sources within the San Joaquin Valley. And the agency that's responsible for that is the San Joaquin Valley Air District. So really helping people understand the root causes of the problem, placing, attribution to where we can actually see change, motivating people and helping give them hope, while also providing them with the basic information about the threats and the risks to their health so that they can protect themselves. Because the unfortunate reality is that our air pollution levels are so bad at this point that we need to be telling people things like, please don't go outside and exercise on a bad air day so that you don't trigger an asthma attack, a heart attack, or a stroke. So we as organizers are trying to build the long-term sustainable movement that we need for fundamental change in such a difficult power dynamic. And part of how we do that is framing.
And maybe if we wait a moment for people to chime in with any questions, another one I might ask you is just, what do you make of these arguments, like the argument that drift is coming from the Bay Area, or drift is coming from China, or just the San Joaquin Valley as a whole? What do you make of those sort of arguments?
Well, the Air District spent a bunch of research money, so you can see the results of their research of how much is coming from the Bay Area and how much is coming from China. So again, you can look at their own data. It's not that much, right? Most of it is coming from us. Now, I'm a geographer by training, so of course it's technically correct that the San Joaquin Valley is a bowl and that we have tall mountains. At the same time, we weren't always the most polluted basin in the United States, right? So fundamentally, what got us there was the activities that were creating the pollution. So if we want less pollution, we have to reduce those activities, right? We can't just use the physical environment as an excuse and normalize and just accept that. One thing also that you mentioned earlier that I wanted to quickly touch on were the economic costs, the health and social costs were not being considered. And CVAQ was a part of helping secure the research that Jane Hall and her colleagues did that actually quantified the health costs and put a dollar amount to it and talked about how many people were dying. And as important as I think that is, honestly, it's also a bit gross that we put a dollar value on people's lives. For me, your ability to play outside, breathe safely, and not die prematurely has a value that I personally would not put a dollar amount on. So the health and social costs are absolutely underestimated and underaccounted for. I see you, Matt. Go ahead with your question.
Yeah, I just had to confirm what I heard just now. So they ran their own research to exculpate themselves?
Yeah, and they spent a lot of money on it.
This is a pet peeve of mine with them and another air agency and who decides what they want to research. How common is that? Do you know across air districts? People cooking up their own softball research problems? Like, are you aware of like another regional air district investigating why it's not to blame for its outcomes? I mean, it really sounds, I don't know. I feel like we're in a research arms race. And if a state agency is researching anything, it needs some consensus from the governed that that's the question we want them to answer. As you know, I'm frustrated all the time when I hear it's not our fault. It's the geography, it's the Bay Area, it's mobile sources get CARB to do their job. I agree that those are all problems. At the same time, they keep permitting, new emergency generators, new stationary sources, and I know what to do about those sources. So I'm just curious about that pattern of district-led research, maybe just in the generic. Do we know anything about that?
Yeah, it's a good question, Matt. I mean, most of my experience has been at the San Joaquin Valley Air District, so I can't necessarily say how much other air districts are using their research to kind of try to pass the buck. But again, I would say, to me, it's just another indicator of the pattern, right? Because that's part of how they used their research dollars to try to explain things. But then you also see how they're taking public funds and putting their elected officials up on billboards saying, make one change. Right. So again, it's a pattern of weaving a narrative and explaining away the issues and attributing blame to everybody but themselves that we see throughout their systems.
Yeah, the billboards are pretty distasteful and pretty shameless. And I think the pattern speaks for itself. I still feel like there's something particularly egregious about, T-balling up a straw dog research question that, somebody at CARB should care a little bit more about. And I'll just have a comment that I'm frustrated in general at sort of the interagency deference where everybody doesn't want to hurt each other's feelings, but they're willing to tolerate another decade of poor performance. And so I know there are agency people on the call, and at some point somebody's got to stand up for us. But I have a specific question for Cade. You kind of concluded with centralization, of I don't know who I'm looking to for hope in this moment. I mean, there seems to me to be a clear jurisdictional opportunity for CARB to say, hey, this job isn't up to snuff. We're out of attainment in these key categories. We're going to step in. I mean, in school districts, we put them into receivership. Police departments, we put them in, chapter 4, whatever they did in Oakland. There's a way for a parent agency to step in. And I don't think we'll ever get that out of CARB, potentially US EPA, but I have misgivings about turning to any agency to save me from another agency. And so I don't know, Cade, if you looked at any of the environmental justice seats being placed on these boards like they proposed in the South Coast Air District. I could see that as being an important signal. I could also just see it as a massive decades-long time sink where a lone EJ seat on an appointed board just takes abuse for a decade and isn't able to reform an agency. So I'm curious to see if you came across any creative solutions for the vacuum of human and community voices in our regulatory arrangement.
Yeah, I appreciate that question, Matt. I think so the theory behind like why it'd be better to centralize the power over these local districts is like, if you think about it in terms of there being like a supply and a demand for regulation over the air, right? When there's when the California like decided to fracture regulatory control in the first place over air quality to the local level, they created about 1,158 different air quality regulators. And so if you're someone in industry, that just demolishes the price, for whatever price there is associated with capturing regulation, right? If the demand is constant and then the supply gets multiplied 1,000-fold, then the price is going to go way down, right? So that's part of it, is that we have this sort of really unique structure of local control over air quality that isn't really anywhere else in the United States. And so I think that's sort of like who ultimately you assign that jurisdiction to. I mean, it's a matter of, whatever you want to write the laws to be, right? Like if there's enough will behind it, we could fix this problem, right? But the problems aren't that there's enough will, because if that were the case, it would have been solved by now. It's because there's really substantial moneyed interest tied up into it.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. That's a new terrifying thing for me to think about. I mean, I always understood it as regulatory redlining and setting up second-class places for second-class protection. But the idea that we're also diluting will across the state to address a problem by saying those problems are over there.
Yeah, it's really effective. It's a really effective method at keeping people out of the picture and sidelined.
Yeah,
I think.
well, thank you.
Well, yeah, no problem. And jumping back real quickly to what you were talking about before in terms of the San Joaquin Valley commissioning its own report, like in that own report, they found that between 7 and 11% of total pollution could be due to drift. I think those are the numbers. And even if that's the case, you did your whole study, you found out that, maybe 7% of it comes from the Bay. The Bay has improved its air quality dramatically over the past 20 years. And now the Valley wants to take credit for improving its air quality by 4%. Well, the Bay did that for you then, right? You can't have it both ways. You can't blame the Bay for the drift. And then if the Bay cleans up its air, also celebrate the fact that, we've cleaned up the air by 4%, right? So you can't have both of those. And I think Dr. Garoupa-White addressed the bulk question really, really well, because to my mind, it's always like, okay, if it is a fact that the San Joaquin Valley is a geographic depression, there's mountains on all sides, right? Then doesn't that further incentivize you to pass harsher regulation? If a place has the environmental conditions such that any pollution is magnified 5 or 6 fold, right? Then wouldn't you want to be more strict in that case rather than less strict? And that's never the solution they prioritize. They always use it as a reason to throw up their hands, but it should be doing the opposite.
I think I'll play devil's advocate briefly on behalf of the Valley Air Pollution Control District. Hold for gasps. There's nothing stopping the state of California from targeting and earmarking investments and intervention strategies for the red rash that runs down the middle of the state either. Because we often hear about how incentive dollars, and we certainly see with cap and trade, that we're still being expected to compete for equity investment. And I think clearly the health outcomes should speak for themselves. I think our local regulatory agencies could have done a better job advocating for us in those incentive fights. But nobody is stopping CARB from actually implementing an equity-based strategy and removing the competitive poverty gladiator phenomenon from California's investment reality.
Yeah, thanks for those comments and questions, Matt. I wanted to speak to your point about environmental justice reps because you anticipated my other case study for my dissertation, which was looking at the creation of the Environmental Justice Advisory Group at the Air District and whether that actually helped to infuse environmental justice principles and outcomes at the Air District, or if it was all for show to check a box. I won't give you the full rundown of the results from that case study, but I will say that the literature suggests that there's very limited success to creating those types of positions. Oftentimes they either are tokenized, marginalized, sidelined. And for me, it gets back to one of the fundamental questions that I'm still asking myself to this day. Is this system reformable, or do we need complete transformation and overhaul? And the longer I do this work and the worse our situation gets and the more plans that fail, the more I have to tell you, I'm convinced, obviously what we're doing is not only not working, it's making our problems in environmental justice communities worse. So if we don't disrupt this pattern, we are all going to be responsible for the situation that we've created. Which is not the most happy note to leave it on, but I did want to note that we're a few minutes over time now. I'm more than happy to stick around if people want to have casual, informal chats and conversations. And again, you'll have my contact information, but do also want to be respectful of everybody's time in the evening and make sure we get the opportunity to thank you all for participating. Really appreciate you all and your presence tonight. We are recording this, so you've consented to be recorded by joining, and we will be posting this to our YouTube channel in case you have colleagues that weren't able to join that want to be able to come look at it and share this information later. So before we completely wrap, I do want to give the opportunity, Cade, if you had any closing thoughts or comments that you wanted to make.
Just on your last note as well, whether or not it's reformable, I think what I was trying to get at with my whole thesis was that the economic conditions make it, they sort of dictate the path, right? They lock you into that sort of system where the Valley's economy is so reliant on agriculture and is so reliant on oil and gas, and that can't really, or that's not really going to change without really harming a lot of people. So trying to inject another supervised seat onto the board, there's still going to be 10, 9, however many other members that have to raise money from other farmers in order to get elected in the first place, right? Like if I think about the criticism that David Couch might have for me when I say like, hey, you took $10,000 in 3 months from farmers, he'd be like, yeah, well, yeah, it's the Central Valley, everyone does that. And I'd be like, well, that's the problem. That's the problem, is that the way that you get power, the way you obtain power via the electoral system in the Central Valley, requires you to placate farming interests, requires you to placate oil and gas interests. And so it's baked in, is what I'm saying. It's sort of baked into the process. Like what it means to be someone with power in the Central Valley is someone who has a relationship with these interests. And unless there's a mass movement of people that look to change that system, then that's going to be the way that it is.
Yeah, that's a super important note to end on, Cade, and I really appreciate your research and being willing to present. Again, for me, it really underscores, from my dissertation, I interviewed Valley Air District agency staff and some of their former board members, and several of them even agreed that in order to get clean air and environmental justice for the San Joaquin Valley, we fundamentally need economic transformation for our region. So I think even some of the decision makers at the Air District recognize that in order to address root causes, we have to transform what we do in the San Joaquin Valley to create health, quality of life, and clean air for everybody to enjoy, but especially our most disproportionately impacted neighborhoods. So really want to, again, thank everybody for joining tonight. And with that, we will wrap. Please be in touch.